Okay. And make sure that's up and running. Guess I should go to my channel, not my channel. Studio. Go live. Alright, hopefully it'll, oh, there it is. Cool. Alright. So, specifically for my online class, or at least 104, not 104, LC4, I'm still not completely done with grading the test for some of you. But I do have an excuse. I had a busy weekend, and this is why.
Is that your own cat? What's his name?
I don't know yet.
Is it a boy or a girl?
We don't know yet.
Do you have any other cats?
I've got many cats. It's just this one. My neighbor was walking around the neighborhood, and it's like, and she comes up to my door. Look what I found. Yeah, no, I've got 4 inside, 2 outside, and that's after a bunch of dogs killed a few of my cats. So, yeah, this one we just sort of found under some leaves, and so that was my weekend. I'm very tired. They are loud, despite how small they are. So yeah, at least for my online folks, this is why not everything's been graded yet. And also why I don't have your guys' stuff up on Blackboard yet. But you've all seen your tests, so you've at least got that. So yeah, that's been my weekend. Thankfully, my mom is as easily swayed by cats as I am, so she's taking care of it today while I'm here. Otherwise, I'd have to bring it in and have it in a box. Okay. So, with that out of the way, we can get back into where we were, because I think we're almost done with this chapter, and then we can start on chapter 6. Which, as a reminder, once we finish chapter 6, then it'll be time for the next test, but we got a little while yet before that's an issue. Yeah, so we had the regulators in North and South Carolina here. The regulators in North Carolina getting destroyed by the North Carolina militia, whereas in South Carolina they actually managed to have enough influence that their demands were met. So it depends on where you were. Would you get murdered or actually have your demands met? From this point on, we are very much moving towards the revolution. British East India Company was given monopoly over tea distribution, which caused more protests in the colonies because the East India Company, well, they've been in charge of India for a while, and that didn't go so well. Most were protests, which is to say refusing to buy or sell the tea. Obviously, boycotts of British goods is one thing, but at this point, the merchants weren't even putting the tea out to sell. Of course, the more famous event here was the Boston Tea Party in December of '73, where, how many was it? 50 men disguised as natives tossed 45 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. The whole disguising themselves as natives thing wasn't really as much of a disguise as it was a statement. As we're going to see a little bit later on, the idea of dressing as natives or using native names was representative of rebellion, really. That was a part of the culture during the day. And also, it took them a while to get 45 tons of tea into the harbor. And needless to say, they were seen by many of the regular public, but with the thing we saw with the trade stalls, nobody said anything because they were all feeling the same way. In response to the Boston Tea Party, though, Britain got real pissed and passed the Coercive Acts, a series of acts that really punished Boston for this. The port of Boston was closed. Massachusetts court was moved back to England, which, again, if you recall from, what was it, last chapter? No, the chapter before. I mean, we're talking about the Puritans. The whole, like at the start of founding Boston and Massachusetts Bay Colony, they had started with the charter here in North America rather than having one back in England. And this was removing that, as well as revoking the charter entirely, and approved a new quartering act so that there'd be soldiers in Boston to keep the peace. Obviously, the colonists didn't appreciate this. They called these the Intolerable Acts and began arming themselves to resist the British. Now, this still wasn't what you would think. I mean, we're going to see. This wasn't the start of the revolution. This was not, oh, we need to become independent from Britain because they're mistreating us so badly. Armed resistance against the British by British colonials was pretty common. See all of Irish history, a lot of Scottish history, even the history of Wales back in the Middle Ages. I'm sure Australia wasn't always getting along, I mean, especially India. So the idea of colonists arming themselves against the British was just another Tuesday. However, beyond just folks getting prepared to fight the British, we had the First Continental Congress. Various colonies met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to discuss what was going on and how they would respond to it. So this was not any kind of unified colonial response, but it was the start of that. It was the beginning of, hey, we probably should not just let Boston sit on its own. We should maybe work together and figure something out. But not everybody was on board. Also, when we talk about like the British Empire, at their height, they controlled most of the world. Besides just our little colonies over here, they had all of Canada by this point. They had a lot of land here in Africa. This is due to something we'll talk about later. India, which was like their main thing. Lots of land throughout the Southeast Asia, and of course Australia and New Zealand. There's part of the Hail Britannia, the sun never sets on the empire, because at any point it was daytime somewhere in the British Empire. Even if it's midnight here, it's going to be the middle of the day over here. So, yeah. So here we have the, quote, disguised folks here overturning tea. This far less accurate representation of this itty-bitty boxes of tea with India tea written on it with a nice big Union Jack in case you missed it. The Able Doctor or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. This was what we saw with the Sons of Liberty, like torturing the Stamp Act collectors. So now it's seen as, oh, this is what's happening to us. Poor us. Like, we were causing issues to begin with. And then this image here, Bostonians in distress, because not only was Boston, shut off from the rest of the colonies, but they were very much under military quarantine. And so you'd occasionally get folks smuggling in supplies for the Bostonians. So the Continental Congress, very important for what's coming. In pretty much the whole next chapter. So they had delegates meeting in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, representing every colony minus Georgia. I don't know if Georgia was just not interested because they were so far away, or if because they were so far away they couldn't get someone there in time. But Georgia wasn't represented, which again, Georgia was like a sliver of land at this period. Most of the guys here had already met and worked together on the various Stamp Act petitions and other, grievances against Britain. So these guys weren't meeting for the first time. That said, they weren't all in agreement right away. There was a lot of division among the men over what they should do. Excuse me. So you had folks like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Christopher Gadsden? Yeah. Who were more radical and wanted an immediate violent response. Moderates like George Washington and John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who still wanted to try to redress what was going on with Britain and avoid an actual conflict. And then folks like John Jay from New York, who felt like things were not so out of control as everybody was saying, and that, we just need to be good British citizens. New York, really until the end of the war, remained like the Loyalist stronghold. So it makes sense that New York would be less inclined to want to actually fight against Britain. That said, John Jay, obviously we know George Washington, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry. John Jay is actually also fairly important. We'll see him in the next few chapters. Once the war is over, I want to say he was part of the first Supreme Court. He was also like a delegate, not a delegate, ambassador. He went over to Britain multiple times. So despite him not being one of the more famous founding fathers, he was around. Like, we see him again. And despite this wide breadth of them not getting along, there was still no real push for independence. Not even the radicals were like, we need to completely break away from Britain, because it was very much in their benefit to remain in the British Empire. If you recall from the previous slide with that map of where Britain was pretty much the most powerful economy in the world at the time, and being a part of that was positive. However, the main issues among these guys was simply that we had a lot of economic freedom for the last 100 years, and now Britain is passing laws and taxes that make things less independent for us. Basically, we had things too good for too long, according to the British, and we needed to be good colonies again, and we weren't happy with that. Also, the Continental Congress put resistance back in the hands of these wealthy elites, because, they were the ones who were in the government, the local governments, and they were the ones now coming together to make a decision, and, as we'll see, they were the ones who really had a lot to lose if we stayed the course with what was going on with Britain and had to pay these various taxes, because they were often wealthy businessmen and had a lot of money tied up in world trade, and this change of policy from Britain was making it so they weren't making as much money as they had been. Also, though, it made it so that each colony wasn't dealing with their own local issues with the British, and now we're coming together to have like a unified collective effort against Britain. So, rather than Boston's dealing with what Boston's dealing with and, Virginia's dealing with what Virginia's dealing with, they're all coming together and sort of seeing the colonies as a whole. So here we have Carpenter Hall in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, same, whatever. It's a really pretty building. I mean, I'm always a fan of red brickwork, and obviously they've kept it just constantly in good shape because it's a major part of our history. And then inside here you have various, plaques and historical stuff, and the poor guys having to dress up in this 18th century crap. Let's see, here we have, First Continental Congress. This is, I believe this is another one of those plaques there at Carpenter Hall. Our government conceived in freedom and purchased with blood can be preserved only by constant vigilance, and that was from William Jennings Bryan in 1908, so that's a little bit later. It's weird that William Jennings Bryan had like anything to do with anything. We'll briefly mention him next semester, and I mean really briefly. I think he's mentioned like once in the entire book. So yeah, that's actually it for this chapter. Sugar Act, Continental Congress, the colonists continued to react to what Parliament was doing, and while a lot of these protests were, against colonial powers, against their local government, it was pretty easy to shift this anger towards the British because what higher authority is there in the British Empire than Parliament? I mean, again, in the Declaration of Independence, we're like, it's the king that did all this. The king wasn't doing crap. It was Parliament. But even as late as 1774, and I mean really into 75 even, there was no real push for independence. Even early 76, and with the Battle of Bunker Hill having happened, it took that long before they were finally like, we actually need to do something. All right. So let's go on to chapter 6. Where's my mouse? There we go. Chapter 6 is revolutions. Because the book likes to be cheeky about its definition. And while there was indeed the American Revolution, there was also a lot of internal stuff going on. But we'll get to that. 1775 to 1783, because the war did last quite a while. So the first bit of armed conflict happened in April of 1775. The various militias and armed folks in Boston had set up weapons caches in Lexington and Concord, and the British found out about it, so like, we're just going to go and capture these weapons or just destroy them so that the colonists won't have weapons to fight against us, so that there won't be the violence. But of course, we had various folks in the colonies that found out about this. Paul Revere with the famous Midnight Ride warning the militia. However, he wasn't like the only dude. There was quite a few other writers, including, I believe, a woman who was involved. But of course, it's a lot easier for us just to remember one guy, so Paul Revere being the main one. Why is it doing this so much quicker now? We, of course, had the Minutemen, the militia that claimed they could be ready in a minute, although that's paraphrasing. They're like, we could be ready in like 15 minutes. I mean, it took nearly 2 minutes just to reload a gun, so. First Shots Revolution happened at Lexington. The Minutemen, formed up there to stop the British. The British formed up in a much more professional manner and fired on the Minutemen, and they scattered. The Battle of Lexington wasn't really a thing. It was more some of our colonists got shot at because they were trying to resist the British. Concord, though, by the time the British got to Concord, the weapons cache there had been moved because they had been stalled in Lexington. So it was sort of a half measure of things actually getting taken care of. But on the way back to Boston, the colonists followed them and harassed them the whole way. Let's see. Patriots in nearby towns have been alerted. Borrowing guerrilla tactics from the natives, colonists hid behind trees, walls, and barns, and battered the British soldiers as they marched back to Boston, killing 73 and wounding 200. So that wasn't too bad. And actually, they did eventually push the British out of Boston because the people there didn't want the British there. The British did come back and recaptured Boston, but for a little while, the Bostonians and the Minutemen pushed the British out. At the same time, we had Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys heading up to Fort Ticonderoga to attempt to capture it, which we'll see the result of that in a little while. So in the Second Continental Congress, in May of 75, the next month, the arguments of what to do about the British came up again, and obviously things had changed since the previous Continental Congress. Now we have folks getting shot at. So a number of them argued that we needed to break away, to have independence. Again, that would be the radicals of the group. While most of the Congress was still on board with negotiating with the British and stopping this before it really got going. But then we had the Battle of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Again, Bunker Hill being the more famous one, but it was a large battle and there was multiple fronts. So General Sir William Howe, the British general who we're going to talk about a lot, managed to defeat the colonists there. However, the British lost twice as many troops as the colonists. Let's see here. June 16th, British forces attacked Patriot fortifications on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. The British won the day when the Patriots ran out of ammunition. You know you're mounting a pretty good defense when you run out of ammunition. You have given it all you've got. The British suffered more than 1,000 casualties, while only half that number of Patriots were killed or wounded. So the Battle of Bunker Hill, despite it being technically a defeat for the Americans, was rough enough on the British that many of the Americans decided that, yeah, independence might be the way to go. Because, this was just like a quickly and hastily thrown together defense on top of like a hill. And while the British did win, it was because they had, supplies, for one. So the colonists figured, well, if maybe we did a coordinated response, maybe we'd be all right. Also, for you guys, does anybody know what Paul Revere's day job was? He didn't go around at night yelling at people as his profession. Any guesses as to what Paul Revere did?
Didn't he do something with lamps?
Well, what he did probably involved lamps. he was a craftsman. Specifically, he was a silversmith, which is to say he was very rich. He was actually one of the wealthiest people in Boston, and when you're that important economically, you're also involved in the politics. So he was also like politically involved in what was going on in Boston, which is weird that like a guy that has that much money and influence decided to get on a horse and like ride into the night to try to warn militia, which like I said, there were other people involved as well. I think he only got to Lexington, and then other members that were there left from Lexington to go to Concord. And then we, of course, have the Minutemen. Yeah, here's the Minutemen drilling. I'll get into that in a minute. Battle of Bunker Hill, which was literally like just a hill, but the fact that you have some level of cover, where's my mouse? There we go. Some level of cover, and also you have the high ground, which is always important. They managed to hold the British back, and again, until they literally ran out of ammunition. So, not too bad. So this battle convinced Congress that they actually did need to create some military resistance to fight against the British. The army, of course, would be led by Brigadier General George Washington, because he was one of the more successful officers from the 7 Years' War. However, the Continental Congress was not a national government. There was still no like centralized leadership in the colonies. While they were unofficially who were calling the shots, they had no authority over the various colonies. So Washington had to go to each colony and have the militia basically volunteer to join him, as well as each colony being just willing to supply the war effort. And not everybody was on board, as we're going to see, with this call for independence. So this wasn't like suddenly everybody in America is against the British. We're all fighting together, the good fight. There is rarely, if ever, that in history. You see a lot more of that with European history, but like when you've got say the Greeks fighting the Persians, it wasn't all Greeks and it wasn't all Persians. Both sides, had mercenaries, and I mean, not all the Greeks worked against the Persians. Many battles in Britain and Ireland between the British and Irish, or even before that, the Vikings, not everybody resisted the incoming invaders and worked with them. So in this case, it's very much the same. Most of Washington's job was less military leader and more herding cats. To get his soldiers to work together or to work at all was most of his job. And really, as we're going to see going forward, and this is really almost sacrilege here in America, but Washington wasn't really a good general. He didn't have very many actual, military victories. What he was good at was inspiring his men and keeping them from not defecting, but deserting and just, going home. He was more of a people manager than he was, some great tactician. Because, if you do any kind of military history, we don't typically talk about any of Washington's brilliant tactical whatevers. He was just good at keeping his men from leaving, which, to be fair, is kind of half of the job of a general anyway. So he was good at that half. So Washington's army had two major tasks to start with: to push the British out of Boston, and then to secure the northern border, because, well, as we've seen, the British were up there in Canada, and they had plenty of troops in Canada. 1775, General Richard Montgomery had captured Montreal. However, reinforcements that were being sent there, led by one General Benedict Arnold, who we will, of course, talk about later. But up until that point, he was still very much a loyal and important general. In fact, he was considered one of Washington's best generals. They were not able to make it there to reinforce due to the cold and smallpox, and yeah, that's never good. So the American troops were not able to push the British completely out of Quebec, otherwise our map might look a little bit different. There was, however, one important victory in the winter of 75 to 76. General Henry Knox took the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and brought them down to Boston for Washington to use. As we recall, the Green Mountain Boys had captured the fort, and General Knox made his way up there to retrieve the weapons. So, using a tactic that we'll actually see again in, well, not so much us here, but the in European history course. This is what Napoleon does early in his career. Is the British have control of a port, and of course the port is going to be at sea level because that's how ports work. But the town, city, whatever, was surrounded by hills. So Washington positioned his cannons up on the hills surrounding Boston and shelled the hell out of it. And turns out the British don't like being shot at, so they left. And thus the colonial army was able to take control of Boston. Here we have General Montgomery. Again, this idea of, oh, we're now Americans. That didn't change how we were culturally. We were still very much British, and we really liked our martyrs. So General Montgomery was killed, I don't know if it was in the battle to take, to take Montreal, but he clearly died dramatically at some point, and we've got this. Here's the Battle of Boston, which was mostly just Washington and his various generals positioning cannons up on the hills and just shelling the hell out of the city. And the British decided they didn't like that, so they left. This map also shows some colonial/pirate ships harassing the British on the way out. The book doesn't really go into it, so we're not going to worry about it, but I just figured that was worth mentioning because it was on the map. Typically, you didn't mess with the British when they were at sea. Their ships were bigger than everybody else's. They had a lot of cannons. And they were also just really good at what they did. When it came to naval warfare, the British, pretty much until World War I, were the only ones who really had any success on the sea. So at the same time, we had Dunmore's proclamation. He was the royal governor in Virginia, which is to say he was, working for the British. And his proclamation was that any slaves that would fight for the British could have their freedom, which caused a lot of trouble for the colonials, because obviously the whole American War of Independence, or War for Independence, was to be freed of British tyranny. And as we've seen already, there's a lot of symbolism implying like freedom from slavery, because of course we're going to be really dramatic. But at the same time, we're not doing like slavery freedom stuff because we got to keep the southern colonies on our side. But the British were like, hey, if you fight for us, we'll free you from slavery. And this caused a lot of issues for the colonists. Now, there were still some colonists who were on the line enough that they wanted to negotiate some settlement with the British rather than continue armed conflict. But Parliament and the King prohibited any negotiation or trade with the colonial powers because, I mean, they were in revolt and they were, rebelling against the government. So rather than coming to peace terms, the British government was like, you guys have decided you wanted to do a war, we'll do a war, we'll kick your butts, and then you're going to come back and be good little colonists. Because, again, armed conflict against the British was a Tuesday. So this inability to negotiate with the British made it so that even the moderates, excuse me, even the moderates had to go to the side of the rebellion. In 1776, there was also a pamphlet written by an Englishman, Thomas Paine, who, again, in my European history course, we talk a lot about. This used arguments both from biblical stories and scientific analogies to basically say that the push for independence was the way to go. This was, all these arguments and ideas that made the push for independence to seem like a good idea. In the first 3 months, it sold 120,000 copies, which in the 1700s is like unheard of, and was used to convince others to rebel all over the colonies, typically in places like taverns and coffee houses where it was just like the regular folk would meet and chat about the issues of the day. And with these arguments written out of common sense, they were able to more adequately articulate their ideas because, well, Thomas Paine was good at articulating his ideas. Within weeks, George Washington wrote to a friend about the sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning contained in common sense. And no, this isn't a typo. The spelling wasn't really standardized back then. Also, you'll see this a lot with primary sources at this time, but there was a lot of weird capitalization back then because at this time, ideas and concepts were often seen as being like proper nouns, so they will be capitalized. Just FYI, that's not anything that's going to be on the test, but that's something I found out. It might have been grad school before I actually heard about that. But that's why you see a lot of this. Like, I'm actually surprised that, reasoning isn't capitalized. So many colonies began taking control of their legislatures. So entire colonies were now calling for independence. They sent an agent to France to request economic and military assistance, which is going to be extremely important because as much as we felt like we could do what we needed to do, we could not. The American colonies could not have won this on their own. We were disorganized. We didn't have a lot of supplies. We barely had an army. We definitely needed outside help. So here we have Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America, written by an Englishman, which is to say Thomas Paine. This is in January of 76. Why is it doing this? Yeah. So you've got armed conflict happening all across the colonies, and again, common sense was really important in this push for independence because it made so many good arguments that it was hard to disagree with. Moderate delegates began to agree that independence was the way to go by June of 76. So, like I said, it wasn't until right before the Declaration of Independence was actually written and published that people in America were actually deciding, hey, maybe independence is the way to go. It wasn't like a long simmering process. It was just kind of at the end. They were like, hey, there's all this stuff's been happening. Maybe we should do the thing. Jefferson, of course, was the main guy to write it. But he wasn't pulling these ideas out of nowhere. Again, this weird mythical memory of the Revolutionary War of Jefferson was some kind of savant that pulled this out of nowhere and put these magical words onto paper and everything was wonderful. He was good at what he did, but what he was doing was taking ideas that had already been spread around the colonies and put them into a single document. I'm not saying he didn't do anything, but he wasn't this prophet that was writing down words from on high. There are some people who really are weird about the early documents. This was written by God. It's it literally wasn't. It was some dude. And this some dude was taking ideas that a bunch of other dudes had already put together for in some cases, in the case of Paine, 100 years. So yeah, but these various ideas, for example, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by Mason in May of 76. All men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights. Boy, that sounds familiar. John Locke, who had written, he's a philosopher from the 1600s in Britain. Or actually, I think he was Scottish. Doesn't matter. He wrote about the social contract theory, that sovereignty rests in the citizens, not some single dude. So in the case of this, just because the king has this royal lineage of however long, doesn't mean they have any more right to rule than the people do. And in fact, if the government is no longer doing for the good of the people, then it is well within the rights of the people to get a new government. So the Declaration of Independence put these ideas together, but again, it's not like Jefferson wrote it overnight and everybody's like, yes, this is the perfect thing. It was debated and revised multiple times over the next few days. Some things were agreed upon. The king had, quote, excited domestic insurrections among us, in regards to Dunmore's threat of freeing the slaves. And another thing you'll see in the Declaration, as I think I mentioned before, a lot of the language was specifically, we are resisting the king. We want to fight against the king's authority and the king's tyranny and blah, blah, blah. When this was a time when the king was, he was a little more than a figurehead, but not much. He was essentially the executive branch of the British government. And it was Parliament that was making all the decisions. So it was easier for us to be like, we're fighting against the king because we want to be a democracy, when Britain kind of already was. But it's harder to argue, we want to resist Parliament because we want to do our own thing. So July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies approved the Declaration. New York abstained because, again, New York was a loyalist stronghold, so it was harder to get the people of New York to agree to straight-up independence. And then it was formally declared on the 4th of July, of course. The declaration was published as a broadside and circulated throughout the colonies, which was technically treason, much like the Sons of Liberty were technically domestic terrorists. The Founding Fathers were very much technically traitors because they were resisting the rightful government of Britain. So here we have the folks signing the Declaration. I don't really have anything more than that. I mean, it's just some dudes signing paper. All right. We can go a little further. So early on, the various groups within the colonies were making their stance known. White servants and black slaves, for example, in Virginia, were very much siding with the British because they felt like they had a better chance of going up in life to some degree, or at least getting out of where they were due to the British making those promises. And both the colonies and the British very quickly did what they could to recruit natives to fight on their side, because while the natives were very much being decimated, they were still in enough number to be important in this war. The British, with Guy Johnson, worked with the Mohawk tribe under Joseph Brant, or his native name, Thean Dangia? I don't know. Joseph Brant is how he's often remembered. The Continental Congress managed to get some Oneida natives to work with them, thanks to the missionary Samuel Kirkland. But for the most part, the natives wanted to remain neutral. Because, again, as we've seen, the natives typically were in a real bad place when it came to any war between European powers, because they were the ones on the front lines getting butchered, and any kind of disease would tear through them rather than whatever rudimentary medicine the European powers had. And as I mentioned, the Loyalists, those that were remaining loyal to the British, mostly were in large cities, New York in particular, Newport and Charleston. And it wasn't just the royal authority that were loyalists. Some did fight with the British because, well, it was the best thing for them economically. But also a number of lower class citizens turned to the side of the British because their landlords had gone to the side of independence. And much like with anything that happens between the British and the French, when one side goes one way, you're going to go the other. So if these wealthy landlords are working with the American Revolution, their tenants who have been oppressed by them for generations are going to work with the British. And the native tribes that did join in, Mohawk, Seneca, and Cayuga in the north, and the Cherokee and Creek in the south, largely worked with the British because, well, as we saw in the previous chapter, the American colonists were really pushing to go west of the Appalachians and settle there, whereas the British government was attempting to stop them from doing that, at least temporarily. So many natives decided that that fighting for the British was probably the best way to go. And finally, the civilians were just screwed either way. Loyalist civilians who had the cities captured by the Patriots would have lots of violence enacted upon them. Women and children would be killed in the streets, women often specifically assaulted, or just straight up, like, exiled into the woods to die. Now, again, this did happen both ways. Whenever the colonial holdings were taken by the British would do the same thing to the colonial civilians. But I just like to mention this because the mythical revolutionary history would never say that the Americans did anything, war crimey against the Loyalists. So here we have folks on the frontier fighting the British. Now, again, some did attempt to maintain neutral, in particular the natives, but both the British and the Patriot forces were not happy with this, so they would try to force the natives to choose a side. Most of the times it was the American forces murdering natives under a flag of peace, which caused the natives to work with the British, because if one side is shooting you while you're trying to maintain neutrality, you might as well work with the other side. This happened in 1777. American soldiers killed the Shawnee chief Cornstalk under a flag of truce, because if there's anything we're good at doing, it's killing natives when they've already surrendered. We'll see a lot more of that this chapter too, or not this chapter, this semester. And colonists who tried to stay neutral often got it from both sides. Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, Shakers, and Moravians tried to maintain neutrality due to moral and religious grounds. Oftentimes, in particular, by the state governments, they would be fined for not joining in. In June of 1978, 9 Mennonite farmers were jailed in Pennsylvania for refusing to take an oath of allegiance, and then their property was seized and sold, which left their family completely destitute. Because, again, we're real good about not doing anything objectionable in this war. Now, that said, it wasn't like these groups were just, oh, well, we can't fight because of our religion. The religious culture itself would punish the people for joining in with either side. Quakers would expel members who supported either side, because, again, the Quakers were very much pacifists, at least until they weren't. We'll get into that later, too. Betsy Ross, who is famous for sowing flags for the rebellion, as well as her husband, joined the rebellion and were kicked out of their Quaker community. Oops, whoops, don't do all that. Yeah. So here we have Chief Cornstalk about to get lit up for existing. Quaker lady detaining English general. We're going to get to this in a little bit as well, where the women who are often just completely overlooked because, oh, they're women. Not like they can do anything about a war. Would do stuff, and often quite entertaining. Here's Betsy Ross, the famous sewing of the American flag. So now that independence had been formally declared, it was even more dangerous to join in. Prior, it was just another dispute among British colonists who don't know what's best for them. Now that it is a straight-up rebellion, you'd be seen as traitors. And the prescription for treason was indeed death. So Ben Franklin, I think it was around this time, Ben Franklin made the rather famous quip, we have to hang together, otherwise we'll hang separately, which is to say, if we don't work together, the British are going to capture us and literally hang us. So while the various soldiers, of course, were out on the field doing their thing, the families of the patriots also had plenty of work to do. Some female patriots did join in the army, which I'll get into a little bit later. Most stayed home and tried to maintain some level of supply because, as I said, there wasn't a whole lot of supply going on in the colonies. Northern women worked to increase cloth production. Women in the South planted crops so there would be food. One of the things we see a lot of is that the colonists didn't really have, they didn't have any kind of uniforms. Many of them didn't have shoes, which wasn't great when the snow came. One famous northern woman, Mary Freyer, Chester County, Pennsylvania, collected clothes and sent them to nearby troops so they would have, some kind of uniforms to use, or at least something to stay warm. The book also mentions Phyllis Wheatley. She was a Bostonian slave who had gained her freedom, learned to read and write, and then used this to send poems to Washington to argue for the equality, or at least the fact that Africans were still very much children of God and should be given some decent treatment in the Revolution. Obviously, we have another war to deal with that, so this one didn't go so well. Some free blacks did work with the rebellion, but most in the South remained enslaved because, as we've seen with Dunmore's proclamation, the Southerners very much did their best to keep them from knowing that this was an option. Any slaves who did have a choice typically went to join the British because, as I said, the British had offered them freedom, which was very important for what was going on. Here we have your typical household in the 1700s. As I mentioned, the big-ass hearth that has like multiple fires burning, so you can, have like tea over here and soup over here. You've got people making food, churning butter back here, sewing thread, and you've got your little gremlins here getting into trouble. Here's a book. Phyllis Wheatley Chooses Freedom. I don't know if that's the best title. Like, I get it. Phyllis Wheatley chose to work for the American Revolution. But like, it implies that she just decided one day, I don't like being a slave anymore, and then just wasn't. I don't know. It's maybe not the best title. All right. Yeah, we'll get into the next section. We still got a little bit of time left. So the summer of 76, Washington tried to pull out of Boston and attack New York, because again, that's where most of the British troops were. However, a number of his soldiers just up and left. This was because the whole colonial... Sorry, this thing over here blinked, and I was waiting on the power to go out again. The colonial loyalties. The people of Boston felt like they had freed Boston, so their job was pretty much done. They just had to keep Boston from being taken over again. Whereas they felt like the men from New York should be the ones to defend New York. So there was still a difficulty of maintaining cohesion between the various members of the colonies. After the Declaration of Independence, General Howe moved into the Hudson River Valley to cut off New England and New York from the rest of the colonies so they would have a harder time working together, which, again, they were having a hard time just because they were stubborn. For God's sake. Another group that was helping the British were Hessians. That is a name for the German mercenaries because Germany didn't exist yet, but there was like their region that spoke German in Britain, or not Britain, jeez, in Europe. So yeah, just FYI. And also, actually, topical for the time of year, the Headless Horseman was by lore a Hessian who lost his head to a cannonball, and that's why he haunts like specifically that region of New England. And actually, we'll get to the author of the Headless Horseman and like where that came from culturally. But yeah, just FYI, the Headless Horseman was Hessian. Also, the British Navy was being run by Admiral Richard Howe, who I'm assuming was related to the general. I think it was his cousin. Let's see. Hessians under command of Richard Howe. It doesn't actually say. Yeah, so they had the Navy, and between the Howes and the Hessians, they were able to completely push the Americans out of Long Island. By November, they had taken Fort Lee in New Jersey, and also hit Fort Washington north of New York City. So they were expanding their hold beyond simply Long Island. In fact, due to the British moving into New Jersey, the Continental Congress fled from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia, whatever, into Baltimore because the British were so close to Philadelphia that they were concerned that the British were about to roll in and hit the city. However, General Howe, the other Howe, was taking things more slowly. He wasn't trying to just like roll in and capture the leaders of the rebellion and force a surrender that way. He wanted to wear down the Continental Army entirely so that they couldn't continue fighting. Because if Howe had swept into Philadelphia and even captured the Continental Congress, well, that would have definitely been bad for the colonists. It wouldn't necessarily have ended the war, because as we've seen, each colony was really just sort of fighting for their own freedom as opposed to like a large overall thing. And I don't think people in Boston would really care that Philadelphia had fallen. And Howe knew that. So if he captured Philadelphia, there would still be resistance. If he completely had the army wear itself out and disband, then the colonies wouldn't be able to fight, and they would have to surrender. So rather than a political victory, he wanted a military victory. That's what that's about. So here we have the campaign in New York, which is mostly just the Americans getting pushed out. It didn't go so well for the Americans. I mean, in fact, yeah, you've got the British here like landing extra troops. Yeah, okay. Here's the Hessians. You can tell by their hats, or if their hats fell off, you can tell by their mustaches. Very, very 18th century German. And then we have the attack on Fort Washington, where Washington escaped to Fort Lee, and then the British rolled in and hit Fort Lee as well. It did not go well for the colonists at the time. So, yeah, this will be, because the next thing is, crossing the Delaware. So, This will do for today. The war isn't going well for the rebels, and it will continue to not go well until we made enough of an impact to have some people join in. So that'll do it. We'll continue this on Wednesday. I'll probably go ahead and put this chapter and the study guide up on Blackboard. Wednesday very much will not be review day, but I just want to go ahead and have that ready for when it is. We'll probably finish it. We might finish it Wednesday, and then we'll do the review next Monday. If not, review next Wednesday.